Pierre Bourdieu, all three woven together. Chapter 3. The Field, the Habitus, and the Beautiful Lie We Tell Ourselves About Merit.
Chapter 1. Before we begin, let me tell you what sociology is actually for, in which the professor refuses to be polite about it. I want to start with a confession. I did not grow up in Paris. I grew up in Denguin, a village in the Béarn region of southwestern France. Population a few hundred. My father was a postal worker. Before him, sharecroppers. I tell you this not to perform modesty. I tell you this because it is the source of everything I have ever written. When I arrived at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris in 1951, one of the most prestigious institutions in France, the factory that produces French intellectuals, I experienced something that took me 20 years to properly describe. I felt simultaneously that I belonged and that I did not belong. I had passed the examinations. I had the grades. By every formal criterion, I had earned my place. And yet, the way certain students spoke, the references they made casually, the restaurants they knew, the paintings they mentioned without explaining, the particular way they held their bodies in a seminar room, as if the seminar room had always been theirs. It had always been theirs. Not legally, not formally, but in every way that actually mattered. And the question I spent my entire career trying to answer was this: how does that work? How does a social order reproduce itself, generation after generation, while convincing everyone, including those it disadvantages, that the outcome is the result of individual talent, effort, and merit? How does hierarchy make itself feel natural? The answer in 3 words is capital field habitus. These are not metaphors. They are analytical tools, precision instruments. And I will spend this lecture showing you exactly how they work. Not in the abstract. In your life. In your choices. In the things you think you like because you like them. Prepare to be mildly uncomfortable. That is how you know sociology is doing its job. Chapter 2. Capital, and no, I do not mean money. In which we learn that the game has more chips than anyone told us. When most people hear the word capital, they think of Marx. Money, factories, the means of production. Marx was right about many things, and I have enormous respect for him. But he was looking at one form of capital, and the social world runs on several. Let me introduce you to the 3 forms of capital that actually organize social life: economic capital, cultural capital, social capital, and a 4th, symbolic capital, which is what any of the others becomes when people forget it is capital at all and start treating it as simply quality, excellence, distinction. That last one is the most dangerous. Economic capital, you understand. Money, property, financial assets. It converts into the other forms with varying degrees of friction. You can buy a private education. You can buy a house in the right postcode. You can buy time. The most underappreciated luxury of the wealthy is simply that they do not have to spend their cognitive energy worrying about money, which frees that energy for everything else. The economists have understood economic capital reasonably well. What they have systematically ignored, because it is harder to put in an equation, is everything else. Cultural capital. This is the one that interests me most. Cultural capital exists in 3 states, and I want to be precise about this because the distinction matters enormously. First, the embodied state. This is cultural capital that has been incorporated into the body itself, into posture, speech, bearing, gesture. into the way you enter a room or hold a wine glass or pause before answering a question. It is acquired slowly over years, through a process so gradual it feels like simply growing up. And this is crucial, it cannot be bought directly. You cannot purchase embodied cultural capital the way you purchase a car. You can purchase the conditions that produce it. A certain kind of schooling, a certain kind of home environment, a certain kind of social world. But the capital itself must be incorporated. It takes time. It takes the right environment from an early age, which means it is enormously difficult to fake in adulthood and enormously easy to acquire if you were born in the right household. Let me give you a concrete example. The British class system. I spent time studying British society, and I found it a particularly useful laboratory because the British are, uniquely, very honest about the existence of class while simultaneously denying that it determines anything. In England, you can tell within approximately 30 seconds of meeting someone which social class they belong to. Not from what they say, from how they say it. The specific vowel sounds. Not just accent, something more subtle than accent. The pace of speech. The vocabulary choices. The degree of self-deprecation deployed, and crucially, the specific type of self-deprecation, because the self-deprecation of Eton is entirely different from the self-deprecation of a comprehensive school in Leeds. This is embodied cultural capital. It was acquired over decades of immersion in a particular class environment. It signals class membership instantly and involuntarily. And it is almost impossible to fully erase in adulthood, which is why working-class people who achieve social mobility often describe a permanent sense of not quite fitting in either world. They have acquired the formal credentials of the new class. They have not fully acquired, cannot fully acquire, the embodied capital. The second state of cultural capital, the objectified state. Books, paintings, musical instruments, objects that embody cultural knowledge. You can own these. You can buy them. But owning a first edition of Proust does not mean you have the cultural capital to read Proust with the familiarity and ease that comes from having grown up in a household where Proust was mentioned at the dinner table. This is the tragedy of the nouveau rich, and I use that phrase not as a sneer but as an analytical description. The newly wealthy can purchase the objects of cultural distinction. The art collection, the tasteful furniture, the holiday to the right destinations. But without the embodied capital to deploy them naturally, the deployment is always slightly off, slightly too deliberate, slightly too visible. The old wealthy do not display their cultural capital. They simply have it. It surrounds them like oxygen. The newly wealthy display it, because they cannot yet breathe it. Let me make this contemporary. Think about what happened in the 1990s and 2000s with the explosion of the creative industries. Suddenly, taste became a profession. Cultural capital became directly convertible into economic capital in ways that had not existed before. The rise of the creative economy, advertising, design, media, fashion, tech aesthetics, meant that the embodied cultural capital of a certain class of educated, culturally sophisticated young people could suddenly be monetized. Silicon Valley is a fascinating case. It produced a new elite that presented itself as anti-establishment. Jeans and t-shirts, no ties, casual speech, the aesthetics of informality. But look more carefully at the backgrounds. The founders of the major technology companies are, with very few exceptions, products of elite educational institutions. Stanford, Harvard, MIT, Reed College. The informality is not the absence of cultural capital. It is a specific, highly refined form of cultural capital the capital of the educated elite that has internalized the rules so thoroughly it can afford to appear to break them. Wearing a gray t-shirt every day requires enormous confidence that you will not be judged for it. That confidence is itself cultural capital. Mark Zuckerberg's t-shirt costs more than your suit. I am not making a moral point. I am making an analytical one. The third state of cultural capital, the institutionalized state. Academic qualifications, credentials, certificates. These are enormously important because they are the mechanism by which cultural capital is officially converted into economic capital. A degree from a prestigious university translates directly, in most societies, into access to better paid employment. But here is what the meritocratic story obscures. The institutionalized cultural capital, the degree, is supposed to measure ability. What it actually measures, to a very significant degree, is the prior accumulation of cultural capital, which is itself distributed according to the social position of the family. A child who grows up in a household with books, with educated parents who discuss ideas, with access to museums and concerts, and the vocabulary of educated discourse, that child arrives at the school examination already possessing enormous cultural capital. The examination then certifies this capital as individual achievement. Genius, hard work, merit. The social conditions that produce the achievement are made invisible. This is not conspiracy. Nobody is sitting in a room planning this. It is the normal functioning of a system that mistakes the social for the natural. The examination does not see the library at home, the summer reading program, the parents who could explain what a subjunctive is. It sees the result and calls it talent. Social capital. The network. The connections. Who you know. This one people understand intuitively, even if they resist its implications. In my definition, social capital is the aggregate of actual or potential resources linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. Which, in plain language, means the value of your connections depends not just on who you know, but on what those people have. A network of wealthy, powerful, well-connected people is not the same as a network of equally warm, equally loyal, equally supportive people who happen to have less power. Social capital is not about friendship. It is about what your relationships can do for you in the field. A historical example that I find particularly illuminating. The Grandes Écoles system in France. France has a parallel university system, the Grandes Écoles, that sits above the regular universities and produces the vast majority of French political, administrative, and corporate leaders. The École Nationale d'Administration. The École Polytechnique. My own École Normale Supérieure. Entry is by competitive examination, formally meritocratic. But who passes the examination? In study after study, including my own research with Jean-Claude Passerin, published in The Inheritors in 1964, and Reproduction in Education in 1970, we found that the student body of the Grandes Écoles was overwhelmingly drawn from the professional and upper classes. Not because working-class students are less intelligent. Because the examination measures a form of cultural fluency that working-class students have had less opportunity to acquire. And once you are inside a Grande École, you are connected for life. The same cohort, the same networks, the same mutual recognition. In France, we have a word for this, la promotion. Your graduating class. 40 years later, the members of your promotion are running ministries, banks, and corporations. And they remember each other. This is social capital in its purest institutional form. And finally, Symbolic capital. This is the most subtle and the most important. Symbolic capital is what any form of capital becomes when it is perceived not as capital, not as accumulated advantage, but as legitimate superiority. When the wealthy man is seen not as lucky or well-positioned, but as successful. When the educated woman is seen not as the product of privileged schooling, but as simply intelligent. When the person with the right accent is seen not as someone who absorbed their class through childhood, but as simply well-spoken. Symbolic capital is the misrecognition of capital as quality. And this misrecognition is not an error. It is the fundamental mechanism by which social hierarchy reproduces itself without appearing to be social hierarchy at all. It appears to be the natural order of things. Talent rising, hard work rewarded, excellence recognized. This is what I call, in the logic of practice, symbolic violence. Not physical violence, not even obviously coercive. The violence of a classification system that the classified accept as legitimate, and often most painfully internalize. The working-class student who fails the examination and concludes, "I am simply not clever enough." The woman who does not apply for the senior position and concludes, "I am simply not that ambitious." The immigrant whose accent marks them as foreign and who concludes, "I must not fully belong here." The social structure speaking through the individual's own self-assessment. That is symbolic violence. And it is far more effective than any external compulsion because it requires no enforcer. The dominated do the work themselves. Chapter 3: The Field Where the Game is Played, in which we discover that society is not one game but many, and each has its own rules. A field, in my usage, is a structured social space with its own rules, its own stakes, and its own forms of capital. Not a metaphor, an analytical structure. The academic field, the literary field, the political field, the economic field, the religious field, the journalistic field, the artistic field. Each of these is a relatively autonomous domain of social practice with its own logic. I say relatively autonomous deliberately. The fields are not completely independent. Economic capital bleeds into all of them. Power relations from the political field affect the academic field. The journalistic field shapes the political field. But each field also has its own internal logic that cannot be reduced to external forces. This is one of my disagreements with a certain crude Marxism that reduces everything to the economic base. A poet who writes purely for commercial success is not playing the literary game by its own rules. The literary field has its own economy, one in which, paradoxically, the most commercially successful work is often the least prestigious, and the most prestigious work often sells very little. This inversion of the economic logic is precisely what defines the literary field as a field. Let me describe how a field works. Every field has what I call a nomos, a fundamental law, a principle of vision and division that defines what counts as valuable in that field. In the economic field, profit, efficiency, return on investment. In the academic field, originality, rigor, the contribution to knowledge. In the artistic field, aesthetic innovation, authenticity, the transcendence of commercial constraint. In the religious field, proximity to the sacred, orthodoxy, spiritual authority. These norms are not simply rules that can be changed by majority vote. They are constitutive of the field itself. A scientist who produces results that confirm his sponsor's product does not become less of a scientist by the field's own logic. He becomes something outside the field. Corruption of the field's logic is not simply breaking a rule. It is threatening the field's existence as a field. Every field is also a field of forces, meaning it is not a level playing field. It has a structure, positions of dominance, and positions of subordination. Those in dominant positions have accumulated the specific capital of the field, academic prestige, artistic recognition, political power, and they use this capital to maintain the rules that perpetuate their dominance. And here is the crucial insight. The dominated also play the game. They do not have a choice in any meaningful sense. If you want to exist in the academic field, you must play by academic rules. You must publish in the right journals, cite the right predecessors, attend the right conferences, deploy the right theoretical vocabulary. You can contest the dominant positions. That is, in fact, one of the main drivers of the field's dynamics, but you cannot contest the rules of the game without exiting the field entirely. The revolutionary artist who refuses all institutional recognition still has to decide, every day, in relation to the institutional field they are refusing. Even negation is a position within the field. Let me give you a rich historical example that I return to often. The French literary field in the second half of the 19th century. This is the period I analyze in The Rules of Art, published in 1992. In the 1850s and 1860s, something unprecedented happened in French cultural life. The literary field became autonomous. By autonomous, I mean, it developed its own internal hierarchy that was explicitly opposed to the external hierarchies of economic success and political power. The key figure in this transformation is Gustave Flaubert. Flaubert did not write for money. He famously refused to compromise his artistic vision for commercial success. He spent 5 years writing Madame Bovary. 5 years on a single novel, with a perfectionism that was financially irrational and artistically revolutionary. What Flaubert created, along with Baudelaire and later Mallarmé and Zola in different ways, was the idea of art for art's sake. The idea that the value of a literary work is determined by its internal aesthetic logic, not by its commercial success or its political utility. This seems obvious to us now. We have internalized it completely. It was, in the 1850s, genuinely revolutionary. It created a field, the autonomous literary field, with its own form of capital, literary prestige, critical recognition, the esteem of other writers. And it created its own hierarchy of contempt. The worst thing you could be in this new field was commercial. Not bad writers can be forgiven if they're interesting. Commercial, writing for money, writing for popularity, writing what the market wanted. This was the new aesthetic sin. Now, here is the paradox I find irresistible. Flaubert, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, the founders of aesthetic autonomy, the men who declared their independence from the market, were almost all from bourgeois families. They could afford to refuse the market because they had economic capital that insulated them from market necessity. The writer from a working-class background who needed to earn money from writing, who wrote what sold, was condemned by this new aesthetic hierarchy as commercially compromised. The aesthetic of disinterestedness, the art for art's sake posture, was itself a class position. Only those who did not need to worry about money could afford to pretend that money did not matter. The bohemian lifestyle, the garret, the deliberate poverty of the artist who refuses to sell out. These are not actually poverty. They are the performance of poverty by people who know they have a safety net. Genuine poverty does not have an aesthetic. It just is. This analysis of the literary field opens into something more general about how fields work. Every field has what I call a specific elusio. Elusio, from the Latin for game, is the fundamental investment in the game itself. The belief that the stakes of the field are worth playing for. An academic who stays up until 3 in the morning to perfect a footnote has illusio. They believe in their body and their practice, below the level of conscious articulation, that it matters, that getting the footnote right matters. From outside the academic field, this is incomprehensible. A footnote at 3 in the morning for a paper that 40 people will read. But within the field, it is not incomprehensible at all. It is the minimum required investment to be taken seriously. The illusio of the academic field includes the belief that precision matters, that citations matter, that the difference between a good argument and an excellent argument matters enormously, even if the practical consequences are invisible. The businessman who thinks academics are wasting their time has no illusio for the academic field. The academic who thinks business people are Philistines has no illusio for the economic field. Neither is wrong. They are simply invested in different games. The political field deserves special attention because it is the field that most directly affects all the others. In my analysis of the political field, developed particularly in language and symbolic power, published in 1991, I argue that the political field has a particular relationship to the rest of social space. It is the field of fields. The field that, more than any other, claims to speak for the totality of social interests. Politicians, professional politicians, I mean, have undergone a process I call professionalization of politics. They are no longer, as in early democratic theory, citizens who happen to hold power temporarily on behalf of the population. They are specialists in the acquisition and management of political capital, electoral support, institutional position, media visibility, party loyalty. And this professionalization creates a structural gap between the political field and the population it claims to represent. The political professional thinks in terms of the political game, party strategy, coalition arithmetic, the news cycle. The citizen thinks in terms of their actual life, work, health, housing, education, their children's future. These two logics are not the same. And the growing disillusionment with professional politics across the democratic world, which has accelerated dramatically since 2008 and the financial crisis, is not, I would argue, primarily about policy. It is about this structural gap. People can sense when they are being addressed by someone playing a game they are not part of. The populist moment we have been living through since approximately 2016, Trump, Brexit, the rise of the far right across Europe, is, among other things, a revolt against the professionalization of politics, against the sense that the political field has become so autonomous, so self-referential, so absorbed in its own internal game, that it no longer connects to the lives of those it claims to represent. I am not endorsing the populist response. The populists have their own forms of capital deployment and their own forms of symbolic violence. But the diagnosis that professional politics has lost contact with the population, I think, is structurally correct. And it follows directly from the logic of fields. Chapter 4. The Habitus, the Social Made Flesh, in which we discover that your deepest preferences were not chosen by you. This is the concept I am most associated with, and the one most frequently misunderstood. Let me begin with what it is not. Habitus is not habit. The word comes from the same Latin root haber, to have, to hold, but habit implies a mechanical repetition of a specific act. I smoke a cigarette after dinner. I walk the same route to work. Habit is conscious and particular. Habitus is the system of durable, transposable dispositions that generates and organizes practices and representations. Let me unpack that sentence because every word matters. Durable. The habitus is acquired in early childhood and early social experience, and it is extremely resistant to change. This is not because people are stupid or because change is impossible. It is because the habitus is incorporated, literally, put into the body, into posture, into reflex, into the speed at which you speak, the volume at which you speak, the vocabulary you reach for without thinking, the degree of physical space you feel entitled to occupy. I grew up in the Bayern. I arrived in Paris at 20. I could learn Parisian French. I could learn the academic vocabulary. I could learn to cite the right texts and participate in the right debates. But the physical reflexes of my early life, the pace, the gesture, the sense of what is normal and what is not, these persisted. Not as failure, as formation. Transposable. The habitus is not a collection of specific rule for specific situations. It is a generative structure, a set of dispositions that can produce appropriate practice across a wide range of situations, including situations that have never been encountered before. Think about what it means to have good social judgment. Not a rule book, not a list of do's and don'ts. A feel for the game. The person who walks into a room and instinctively knows who is important, what register of speech is appropriate, what topics are welcome and which will create tension, how long to stay, when to leave. This is habitus. It is not thought. It operates below thought. It is the social structure of perception, the particular way of seeing the world that was produced by a specific social trajectory, and that produces specific social practices. Let me make this concrete with an example that I develop extensively in distinction. Food. How you eat. What you eat. When you eat. With whom you eat. What you talk about while eating. Whether you consider the food or just consume it. In my survey research for distinction, conducted in France in the late 1960s and early 1970s, covering over 1,000 households across different class fractions, I found that food preferences correlated with social position in extremely specific ways. Working-class households tended to prefer food that was abundant, substantial, practical. Meat over fish because meat is filling. Cheap cuts that could be cooked long and slow. The emphasis on quantity, a full plate, as both necessity and pleasure. Professional class households tended to prefer food that was light, varied, sophisticated. The emphasis on quality over quantity. Presentation. The vocabulary to describe what was being eaten. But here is what I find most revealing. These preferences were not experienced as class preferences. They were experienced as personal taste. The working-class person who found nouvelle cuisine absurd, tiny portions arranged decoratively, was not making a class statement. They were experiencing a genuine aesthetic response. That food seems ridiculous to me. I don't understand it. I wouldn't enjoy it. The bourgeois person who found chips and ketchup unsophisticated was not being deliberately snobbish. They were genuinely unable to understand the pleasure. Tastes feel natural because they are the naturalization of the social. The habitus converts social position into aesthetic preference, and then presents that preference as pure subjectivity. I like what I like. Which is true. But what you like was shaped by where you come from. Which is also true. The habitus allows both to be true simultaneously. Now I want to address something that I am frequently accused of. Determinism. People read distinction and say, Bourdieu thinks we are all trapped by our class background. There is no agency, no freedom, no possibility of change. This misunderstands the concept fundamentally. The habitus is not a destiny. It is a probability distribution. It makes certain practices more likely and others less likely, given the social conditions in which it was formed. It does not determine outcomes. It shapes the range of outcomes that feel possible, natural, appropriate, desirable. And here is the crucial addition: habitus can change. When the conditions in which a habitus was formed diverge significantly from the conditions in which it must operate, what I call hysteresis, the habitus begins to malfunction, producing practices that are no longer adequate to the situation. The classic historical example: the French nobility after the Revolution. The old French aristocracy had a habitus formed over generations of absolute social dominance. The bearing, the expectations, the sense of entitlement, the particular forms of sociability. After 1789, the material conditions that had produced and sustained this habitus were abruptly removed. Many of the old aristocracy were destroyed by this gap, unable to adapt to a world that no longer matched their dispositions. Others adapted, sometimes brilliantly, but the adaptation was always marked by the old habitus. You could tell. The revolutionary, who was once an aristocrat, always carried something of the aristocrat. Even in opposition, the formation shows. A more modern and more uncomfortable example: the global financial crisis of 2008. The bankers and financiers who created the conditions for the crash had a habitus formed in the extraordinary conditions of the 1990s and early 2000s financial boom. A habitus in which risk was rewarded, complexity was status, leverage was sophistication, and the entire field had developed an internal logic completely detached from the material economy of production and employment. The mathematical models they used, the derivatives, the collateralized debt obligations, the risk assessment algorithms, were not simply tools. They were the objectified cultural capital of the financial field. The complex model was the financial equivalent of the literary footnote at 3 in the morning. It demonstrated mastery of the field's specific language. It impressed other players in the field. And it was entirely disconnected from the question of whether the underlying assets were actually worth anything. When the crash came, many of the people responsible genuinely did not understand what had happened. Not stupidity, habitus. They had the dispositions of a field that no longer corresponded to reality. The hysteresis of the financial habitus. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that continues to astonish me, is how quickly the field reconstituted itself. The same institutions, the same logic, the same forms of capital. The habitus of finance is extraordinarily resilient. Because the conditions that produced it, vast concentrations of economic capital, state protection for systemically important institutions, the conversion of financial complexity into social prestige, were not fundamentally altered by the crisis. The game continued, with the same players. Chapter 5: Distinction and the Beautiful Cruelty of Taste, in which we arrive at the book that made people most angry with me, and I explain why they were right to be angry. Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. Published in 1979. Still generating arguments. Good. The central argument of distinction is simple to state and almost impossible to fully accept. Taste is not personal. It is positional. What you like in art, in music, in food, in clothing, in home decoration, in holidays, in the people you choose to spend time with, is a social product. It is the materialization of your position in social space. And it functions, this is the crucial part, as a mechanism of distinction, as a way of marking and maintaining the differences between social groups. Let me give you the most contested example in the book. Classical music. In my survey data, knowledge of and preference for classical music correlated very strongly with educational level, and through education, with class position. Not perfectly. There are exceptions. There always are. But the pattern was clear and consistent. Now, the standard interpretation of this finding from within the dominant culture is: classical music is objectively more complex, more demanding, more rewarding than popular music. Those who appreciate it have developed their aesthetic capacities more fully. The correlation with education reflects the fact that education develops aesthetic capacity. QED. My interpretation is different. Classical music appreciation is a form of cultural capital. It is acquired through exposure, through a childhood in which classical music was present, discussed, valued. The child who grows up in a household where Mozart is played at dinner is not developing superior aesthetic capacity. They are developing familiarity with a specific cultural form that the dominant class has defined as superior. The definition of classical music as high culture is not a neutral aesthetic judgment. It is the imposition of the dominant class's cultural preferences as the universal standard. What I call in distinction cultural arbitrary. Arbitrary meaning it could have been otherwise. There is nothing inherently superior about a symphony over a blues song, or a string quartet over a griots performance in West Africa. The hierarchy is socially produced, and then naturalized as aesthetic fact. This argument made a lot of people very angry, particularly educated people, particularly people who had worked hard to develop their cultural knowledge and who experienced my argument as an attack on their genuine achievements. I understand this reaction, and I want to address it directly. I'm not saying that the experience of great art is false. I'm not saying that aesthetic experience is reducible to class position. The person who genuinely loves Beethoven is genuinely loving Beethoven. What I am saying is that the social conditions that make it possible to love Beethoven in that particular way, with that particular vocabulary, that particular ease of reference, that particular sense of entitlement to the concert hall, those conditions are not distributed equally. And when the appreciation of classical music is used, as it systematically is, as a marker of intelligence, of cultivation, of being a certain kind of person who deserves certain kinds of social positions, then the aesthetic is doing social. It is reproducing class hierarchy through the language of taste. And that is what I find worth analyzing. The complexity I want to add now, because simple arguments are almost always wrong, is the question of how the field of cultural production has changed since I wrote Distinction. I was writing about France in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The cultural landscape of 2025 is dramatically different in some ways and disturbingly similar in others. Different ways. The internet has democratized access to cultural content in ways that were genuinely impossible in 1979. A young person in a village in rural Romania can now access the same music, films, literature, and intellectual content as a young person in central Paris. This is real. I do not want to dismiss it. But access is not the same as the cultural capital to interpret and deploy what you access. The internet has given everyone access to the Louvre. It has not given everyone the embodied cultural capital to stand in front of a Velázquez and know what they are looking at in the way that a child raised in a certain kind of household knows. The information is available. The formation is not. The new form of cultural capital in the digital age is what some of my successors call omnivorous taste. Research conducted since the 1990s has suggested that the cultural elite in contemporary societies is not defined by exclusive preference for high culture. It is defined by the ability to move fluently across multiple cultural registers. The educated professional who knows classical music and also knows hip-hop, who can discuss contemporary art and also discuss football, who is equally at home at the opera and at a street food market. Some have argued that this omnivorous taste represents a democratization of cultural capital, a loosening of the rigid high-low distinction I described. I think this is partially true, and mostly a new form of distinction. The ability to move fluently across cultural registers is itself a form of cultural capital. It requires the security, the education, the broad exposure to multiple cultural worlds that comes from, you will have guessed, a privileged social position. The truly omnivorous taste is not available to everyone. It is available to those who have enough capital to invest in multiple fields simultaneously. The tech executive who knows jazz and cricket and contemporary fiction and Japanese cuisine is not demonstrating the absence of distinction. They are demonstrating a new and more sophisticated form of it. The distinction of those who are beyond distinction, which is, of course, the most distinguished position of all. Let me close with something that I think about often. The question I am most frequently asked after all of this is, what should we do? And I confess, I find this question both necessary and slightly naive. Slightly naive, because knowing the mechanism does not automatically produce the solution. The fact that I can show you how symbolic violence works does not mean the showing is sufficient to stop it. But I do think sociology has a task that goes beyond description. In what I call reflexive sociology, and I developed this most fully in an invitation to reflexive sociology, written with Laik Wakwin in 1992, I argue that the sociologist must turn the tools of sociology on sociology itself. Must ask, what are the conditions that produce my own thinking? What capitals do I possess? What field am I operating in? What are my own elusio? This is not comfortable. It was not comfortable for me. To recognize that my own trajectory, from the son of a postal worker in the Béarn to a professor at the Collège de France, was not simply the result of talent and hard work, but the result of a specific intersection of social conditions, historical moment, institutional paths, and not inconsiderable luck. To recognize that my very capacity to produce this critique was shaped by the institutions I was critiquing. But I think this recognition is the beginning of something. Not revolution, not overnight transformation, but the slow, difficult, necessary work of making the invisible visible, of refusing the naturalization of the arbitrary, of insisting, against the enormous gravitational pull of the established order, that things could be otherwise. That the child from Denguin does not have to feel like an imposter in the seminar room. Not because the seminar room is neutral. It is not neutral. It never was. But because understanding that it is not neutral is the first step toward building one that comes a little closer. The coffee is cold. The lecture is over. You may now disagree with me. I encourage it. Disagreement that understands what it is disagreeing with is, in the end, the only form of intellectual respect. Anything else is just taste. And we have established, I think, what taste is.
Pierre Bourdieu, 1930 to 2002. Born in Denguin, Pyrénées-Atlantiques. Died in Paris. Principal works referenced in this lecture. The Inheritors with Jean-Claude Passeron, 1964. Reproduction in Education, Society and Culture with Jean-Claude Passeron, 1970. Outline of a Theory of Practice, 1972. Distinction, A Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste, 1979. The Logic of Practice, 1980. Language and Symbolic Power, 1991. An Invitation to Reflexive Sociology with Laik Wakwin, 1992. The Rules of Art, 1992. The Weight of the World, 1993. The seminar room remains. Some of us still feel like imposters in it. Understanding why is, perhaps, the beginning of something.